Good evening, everyone. My name is Chrissy Kelly. I am the founder of Absent, and welcome tonight to our 9th Tuesday evening webinar. I am delighted to welcome Professor Ilona Croy of the University of Dresden. She is a psychologist who works with Professor Thomas Hummel and of course has her own lab. And she is an expert in the field of olfaction and well-being. I am also joined tonight by Professor Barry Smith, and Barry is, as you probably already know, director at the Institute of Philosophy of the University of London's School of Events Study. He's the founder of the Center for the Senses. So welcome to you both, Ilona and Barry. And of course, as always, we have Aidan Kirkwood, who is wearing his headphones and helping me out tonight. Aidan will be manning the Q&A panel. And I would like any of you who are watching, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A panel, not in the chat bar. And we hope to kind of, we encourage you to sort of join in the conversation this evening. So if you have anything that you'd like to say about this subject of well-being and smell loss, we really want to hear from you. So Ilona, thank you so much for joining us. It is a real pleasure to have you here. Your research interests include investigating the neural markers of mental health, and especially in conjunction with olfaction and touch. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of an overview of your work, especially as it relates to this area of smell loss, and in particular smell loss and COVID-19. As I'm sure you're aware, there are a lot of people out there who are coming into our Facebook group. We're closing in on 7,000 members. And I would say that well-being is a really hot topic. People are really struggling. So what can you tell us about this subject?
Yeah, hey, thank you so very much for the invitation, Chrissy. What I can tell you is there is a link, definitely there's a link between depression and olfaction. And this link, this is fascinating, this is bidirectional. So people who lose their sense of smell are more vulnerable to depression, and the other way around. So depressed individuals have a decreased sense of smell. For the sake of this topic here, I think we should stick to the first one. So people who lose their sense of smell are more prone, more vulnerable for depression. And the interesting idea or the interesting question is, why is this? And what we are suggesting is there are two pathways. The first is a very simple one. People are more depressed because they suffer from a loss. They lost something which they valued before or which they now value just because they don't have it anymore. And to this respect, it's probably interesting to see what the functions of olfaction are. So the functions relate to ingestion, just enjoying your food or determining which food you want to have. And they relate to hazard avoidance, the hygiene behavior and all of this stuff, and social communication. So I smell my children, I smell my husband, sexual experiences, which are of course related to the sense of smell. And all of those functions, when you lose them, you suddenly become aware that there are a lot of experiences which you probably did not even think you had enjoyed. For instance, the smell of your pubertal son. But now that you can't have them anymore, you feel the loss and you suffer from it. So this is the one way of the relation between depression and olfaction. And people can cope with this, but it may take a little bit of time. And the other way is not the psychological explanation, it's the neural explanation. And this is very speculative, very hypothetical at the moment. There are very few research questions which really tackle this question. But what we believe is true is the following. The olfactory channel feeds into those brain circuits which are responsible for emotion generation. And if you want to generate an emotion, you have to have a certain number of synapses, of nerve fibers, which generate a signal. And some of those nerve fibers relate to olfaction. And if it's just fewer of those, then it's just harder to generate emotions in general, and that's why you may experience this, yeah, ahedonia and lack of motivation.
Right. So just because there are many people in the audience that might not understand that fully, I'm going to try and paraphrase, that it's not just missing the activities or missing the experiences that you described in the first instance. So enjoying our food, for instance, enjoying the smell of our partner, but also what you're saying is that there is a functionality in the brain that is not perhaps being adequate for the generation of certain emotions. Have I understood that correctly?
Exactly. As I said, we are not quite sure how this works. So this is just the most likely explanation at this time today.
Right.
But the idea we have this, or why we have this, is because of this bidirectional link. And what we recently saw is we investigated participants who were hyposmic, so who had a reduced sense of smell. And we just showed them different pictures, emotional pictures. And we found that for them, it's much harder to generate an emotion out of picture, not out of olfaction, just of plain pictures. And we also found a reduced activation of these emotional brain circuits.
So can you explain to us a little bit about this experiment with the pictures? What exactly did that entail?
So there were patients who were hyposmic and not since birth, but they lost their sense of smell.
Right.
Most of them because of sinonasal disorders, not too different from the COVID. And for a certain amount of months at least, so this were patients actually from Thomas Hummel's patient database. And then we gave them those pictures from the International Affective Picture System. This is just a standard database of emotional pictures.
So these are pictures of faces? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not faces, it's a different picture. So it's a huge data set, about 1,000 pictures. All of them are rated by thousands of participants for their emotional content. So a typical picture could be a picture of a wedding, or a picture of a baby, or a picture of a firestorm. Yeah, so pictures which are very arousing, emotionally arousing, positively or negatively.
Okay. And you found that the people who were hyposmic were not reacting strongly in an emotional way to these pictures.
Exactly. This is the first what we found. So we just asked them, how arousing do you think this picture is? And it's totally naturally that people in such a laboratory condition, some of them will say, oh yeah, I mean, it's a wedding, but actually it's not my parents. Yeah. But that's why we have the control condition. And that's why we have the people who have a sense of smell. So we see that the hyposmic people, they rate their arousal less than the control people do. And shortly after, we put the participants into the fMRI scanner, and we just watched their brain activation while seeing exactly the same pictures again. And then we saw that the brain activation in these limbic areas, especially amygdala and hippocampus, was reduced.
Interesting. Okay. So Barry, as someone who has a sort of unique take on our senses and how we interact with the world, how do you see this? What's your impression of how the sense of smell affects people's well-being?
Well, I think it's interesting to reflect on what Ilona just said, and she beautifully laid out what happens when the signals going into the brain are not as strong or not coming from the olfactory sources. We're not getting the smell inputs to the brain that are as strong, as intense, and therefore we're perhaps not activating those centers of the brain that people say are associated with emotion. But if we're talking about the amygdala, again, as Ilona said, this is a center that's very associated with arousal. So one thing I'd like to talk about just briefly is going in the other direction, because quite a lot of people who do professional wine tasting and indeed restaurant critics, including some rather well-known TV personalities who work on food, have said to me, is it true that when you're in a bad mood or you're not in a good mood that you don't taste as much or you don't enjoy things as much in food? And I said, well, that's interesting, because when your affect, your emotional responsiveness is low, we know that that means you're getting much less out of smell. Your sense of smell is not as acute. And that's probably why, because of smell's enormous contribution to what we call tasting, which is always taste, touch, and smell, but smell being a large part of it, when we're feeling kind of flat, we don't really savor our food. We don't get as much enjoyment out of it. And that's probably, I hope Ilona agrees, but that's probably because the olfactory dimension of it has gone way, way down. And I even know when I'm trying to do wine tasting, if I'm not in a particularly aroused state of mind, I'm not getting very much, and I just have to write it off. It's not happening.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting you say this, Barry. This relates very well to a study we once did, where we put our participants in a sad mood or in a neutral mood by just making them write down autobiographic memories, which were either very sad or just some autobiographic memories. And after they wrote down those very sad autobiographic stories, they had a reduced sense of smell.
Wow. There you are. I think it's true. Perfectly. And I was talking to a famously grumpy chef, and he was worried, I think, that he was losing his sense of smell. But I told him smell was definitely conditioned by mood. And after that, I think he was relieved. I'm not losing my sense of smell. He perked up, and maybe he even enjoyed his food a little bit more. But that also shows you why the two are very connected. If you're not getting your sense of smell delivering what the food provides, your enjoyment and your arousal will be low. And that, as you said, is one of the routes to having a little more depression or a little more disappointment in the usual things in life that we take pleasure in.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I mean, I've noticed sort of in the last 8 years, which is how long it's been since I lost my sense of smell, that, and I'm mostly recovered now, that the food is always good when I'm feeling good. And so obviously, and now that you say it, of course, it makes perfect sense that the most enjoyable meals that I've had are meals where I am, you know, in a sort of happy situation.
Yes, and vice versa, because I think, you know, if you're getting a lot of enjoyment and savor from the food, what you carry away from that experience is a feeling of it being a lovely, pleasurable time, a wonderful evening. Paul Rosen, who is very important for smell researchers, who first identified our two routes to smell through the nose, through the mouth, as having different functions and different sources of pleasure. He did a very large study recently where he asked people to describe one of the best meals they've had, and they talk about everything else except the food. The room was lovely, the staff were very friendly, there were lots of people there. But what they don't realize is if the food had been pretty lousy or ordinary, they probably wouldn't have had those happy, excited feelings. So I think smell is contributing to lifting mood, and the depression of mood is contributing to lack of smell. Do you think so, Ilona? You think that's right?
I guess so. I was just reading the questions and answers. Sorry for that. I was just a little bit sidetracked because I saw that there are some, and I just wanted to see whether this is accessible. Sorry.
I think actually maybe.
But I totally trust you. Whatever you said, it's probably absolutely right. Yes.
We agree, Barry. We agree. Aidan, let's go to some questions, and sure. let's put some questions to Ilona and Barry.
Sure. Sina here asks, well, doesn't ask, but more says, I see a therapist who is very nice and helpful, but she really doesn't understand what I'm going through. My family and friends don't get it. I'm angry, depressed, scared, frustrated, disoriented.
Yeah. I would take that. It is extremely hard for people to imagine that you lose your sense of smell. So if I understood it right, Christina lost her sense of smell, or at least it sounds to me like this. So she's probably anosmic. And this is very hard because this is a dimension you can't really see, and that's why you can't relate to us. So we did a study once, and I mean, not only we, other people as well. We wanted to see how long does it take until people notice that someone is born without a sense of smell. Because it's very, very sudden. You realize that the child is not able to hear or that the child is not able to see. I mean, it also takes a couple of months eventually, but then you realize this. For the sense of smell, it takes about 10 years until finally someone, the child itself or someone else, realizes something may be wrong. And then afterwards, it takes another 10 years until the person is finally diagnosed. And here something else, something very similar happens. Although Christine herself knows something is different, it is very hard to talk to the environment to this, just because it's so seldom talked about. And then all of the impairments, they are very obvious when you can't hear or when you can't see. But when you can't smell, then, I mean, the impairments are not really good to see. So what I would say is be patient with your therapist. She or he can't do any better because she or he may not have the experience herself and may not have another patient who had this before. Just try to explain it. And what we see is that, so for you, if you don't get back your sense of smell immediately, or maybe not at all, which also could happen, of course, then it's two things you need to do. First is coping, second is acceptance. And in order to facilitate this coping and acceptance, what is helpful is to talk about this and to get the social support, which is actually helpful for a lot of things and also for smell loss. So what you could try is just train to talk about what's really hard for you. And maybe that could also be the case. It's a little bit hard for you to talk about it in a way that makes it easy for other people to understand you. So maybe you are quiet very, very soon. So you say something like, "Ah, yeah, and I couldn't smell." And then the other one says, "Uh-huh," and changes the topic because he or she does not really understand how important this is for you to talk more about it. So maybe you could train this kind of communication.
Mm-hmm. Right, Aidan, next question.
Sure. One of the attendees here says, asks, is smell important to intimate relationships?
Sure.
Ilona, this is your area.
Sure, definitely. So, as Chrissy said, we did a lot of research about depression and olfaction. And this is very nice, and I very much like it. And never the media really talked about it. Yeah? Depression and olfaction, I mean, it's kind of boring. And then once we did a study, twice we did a study. But the first study we did was about olfaction and orgasm frequency. And this was all over in the media, just because orgasm frequency, yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let me tell you the outcome of the story or of the study. And this was just a survey study. So we did not really observe anyone during the act. We just asked people. And when we ask people, then we find the following. People who have a very good sense of smell, they don't say, "I want to have more sex." So the sexual desire is not increased. And neither is the sexual performance increased, but the pleasure is increased. So when you have a very good sense of smell, you seem to get more out of the experience. It seems to be more rewarding. And in women, the orgasm frequency is also enhanced. For men, actually, could be the same, but we didn't ask. We were extremely biased. So in the second study, what we have done then is we asked people who are hyposmic, how did your sexual life change after you became hyposmic or anosmic? And then about half of the people said nothing changed at all for several reasons. One of the reasons may be that we had a very huge time span, so we were not even sure whether all of these people were sexually active on a very frequent basis at all. But there was also quite a proportion for people who said, "Oh yeah, actually my sexual life was really impaired." And it was impaired, and then you really have to dig down to the answers, to the individual answers. And then people say something like, I can't smell the body odor of my partner anymore. I can't feel the sweat of my partner anymore. I really love to have my head to the breast of my partner and just do something like this, just taking a sniff. And that's just an experience which is lacking, which doesn't mean that the whole sexual experience is not working anymore, but it means what I said before, that you have to compensate a little bit harder. Mm-hmm.
I certainly think that, this has come up in the Facebook group. It's also come up in private messages that people do feel great despair about the loss of intimacy after they lose their sense of smell. And, I always think that, for anyone who is experiencing, if you're sad in any way, you use your sense of smell to soothe yourself. Mm-hmm. It is the thing that you go to for pleasure when you are feeling devoid of pleasure. And when you've lost your sense of smell and you're in a sexual situation, again, you have lost that access to a certain kind of pleasure that just goes beyond the actual experience of, the way you describe it, sort of smelling their skin. But it's more global than that. It's a sort of a full experience. And people say over and over again, it's like putting my arms around a cardboard something. It just doesn't even feel real.
Yes. I could imagine that's right, and maybe there are a couple of things that could be involved here. One is that, in good intimate sexual relations, you want to be immersed in the other person. You want to be sort of fully bound up and involved with them. So if you take one of the dimensions away, that familiar sense of smell, if you take that away, you are being presented with someone who seems not quite the same, not quite as they were, not as familiar, not as reassuring, and also not as comforting in that way. Plus, there may be even odors that in the context of sex are exciting, and those are missing. But there's another thing here, which I think a lot of people who lose their sense of smell, and even some people who've never had a sense of smell have, and that is they have an anxiety about their own body odor. They have anxiety about their own smell and how attractive or appealing that is to someone else. And even though most of us can't judge that very well anyway, the extra anxiety of whether, I've worn this shirt too long and I should change it, or whether, I've been sweating, is my body odor offensive? I think a lot of people who lose a sense of smell do have that anxiety. And that probably in the context of sexual intimacy, to have any anxiety about oneself is going to kill the moment rather.
Yeah. Yes.
Let me add to that a little bit. I think it's very valid what you say, both of you. So it's not just the arousing sexual odor which you have, but also body odors, they transport familiarity. So we are able to recognize our loved ones just by body odor. If you present two T-shirts, one is of your partner, one is of some random person, people above chance are able to say, okay, this is my partner. Or I like this odor more. And that, of course, contributes to the feeling of security. This is a safe situation. No one is going to harm me here, so I can just relax in that situation. And that's just another channel, in addition to the facial perception and the voice perception, of course, it just adds to the feeling of comfort. And that may relate to something else you said, Barry, about people who are born without a sense of smell and the insecurity. We also did this study once. We asked people who were born without a sense of smell about their sexual relationships. And what we found there was that men told us, as compared to other normosmic men, that they have less sexual relationships. So we just asked them, how many different intimate relationships did you have during the course of your life? And the average Dresden man would say 10. Yeah. And the average Dresden woman, normosmic, would say 4. Very strange per se, but okay, never mind. And the Dresden woman who was born without a sense of smell would also say 4. And the Dresden man who was born without a sense of smell would also say 4. So there's quite a discrepancy between men who were born with and without a sense of smell. And one may be that those men without a sense of smell are eventually just not exaggerating as much. So we can't trust the normosmic men, could be. Or it could be that they just have less reward from the sexual experience. Mm-hmm. Or they are a little bit more insecure, as you said, when it comes to social relationships, and they are just not going around so much and approaching women. And for the women on the other side, we didn't see something on the number of sexual relationships, which is a very, very rough approximate anyhow, but we saw something about insecurity. And those women without a sense of smell, they told us, I am a little bit more insecure in my partnership as compared to normosmic women. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm.
Very interesting. Aidan, do we have another question?
Sure. Andrea asks here, really interesting connection with emotions in both directions. Have there been any studies related to parosmia as well?
Right. So I think she was asking Ilona about this thing that you brought up in the beginning, which is that it's a bidirectional thing, well-being and sort of olfactory bulb health. So how do you, or let's say with olfactory loss and in this question parosmia, what can you say about that?
Let me start, and maybe Barry can feed in. As I am aware, there is not too much. What I know is that people who have a depression, so if you come from this end, you go into a psychiatry ward or somewhere else, and then you survey the people with depression, then those have enhanced rates of parosmia as compared to normal population. And the other way around, people with parosmia, I would very much think so that they also have enhanced depression rates, just because it's a very annoying situation which those people suffer from, especially when this is a chronic disorder. And I would think that this is rather similar to tinnitus, where we know that people also have enhanced rates of depression. Actually, I'm not aware of a study.
No, I'm not aware of any studies either, and you would know far more than I, but it does strike me there's a bit of a paradox here, which is when people have just encountered parosmia, they usually detect it with foods that they used to like, drinking their coffee or eating chocolate or some roasted meat, which they now find particularly horrible. And the funny thing is, there is some emotionality here because they're very aroused to the point of disgust by these seemingly familiar things now appearing dreadful, smelling awful, being very repellent. And maybe even the violation of expectations, thinking you're going to get a reward and then having something so off-putting, does flare up the emotions. Over time, I imagine you're right, Ilona, that there'll be a sort of slackening off towards depression if it doesn't change, and an anhedonia where you're getting less contentment. But it is interesting, it has an arousing effect, usually that disgust reaction. Is that right, Chrissy? I'm thinking that's how people...
Yes, I mean, as you talk about it, I am thinking about how emotionally aroused people are getting when they describe their disgust reaction to food. It's not a sort of, no, that doesn't appeal to me, but it is a real anger almost. People are really responding aggressively almost to these smells. And I mean, we have a pretty good idea. I mean, I'm working with Jane Parker at the University of Reading to kind of learn a bit more about what kind of odor molecules are responsible for this. So we do have an idea, but but the emotional response to these smells is striking.
It's strong. And it may be because, and this is compatible with everything that we were talking about earlier, and Ilona was setting out so beautifully and clearly. It may be because it's not an absence of olfactory input. It's precisely an olfactory input that you'd rather not have, that's actually dominating an awful lot of your experience. And so it's having the usual arousing effect that odors do, but here very negatively. It's certainly, I'm hoping we can encourage Ilona into another study on this.
Related to this, I think it's puzzling that orders are very seldom neutral. They are positive or they are negative. And of course, there are neutral orders if you look at a group of individuals. But if you look at one individual, then normally people have an opinion to every single order. So if you try to do a study with a neutral order on an individual level, it's almost impossible.
But that's so interesting, Ilona, because what we see in the group, and I've experienced myself, is that when you have total smell loss and you come back from that to parosmia, and in my case, I had severe parosmia, you lose your ability to smell something and immediately know, is it good or bad?
Yeah.
That ability is gone. So what you are presented with a smell, and you don't know whether it's a food that smells good because it's okay, or if it's a food that's spoiled and really smells disgusting.
Yeah.
And so there you are, and you're still trying to evaluate that, and you've got no way of saying yes or no.
Exactly, yeah, and you really get contradictory information. You get the wrong information. It's like talking to a person who is constantly smiling while sticking a knife into your breast. So you just can't trust it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so Aidan, I see 2 more questions.
Yeah, so one of them was just finished. Sina here says that I also feel that I'm always on my guard to dangerous odors such as gas, tainted food, etc.
Yeah. This is something which very, very often pops out when people are surveyed about what they experience after olfactory loss. Then the normal survey question is something like, are you afraid of some hazards, like not detecting a gas leak? And then, of course, people with hyposmia or anosmia, they say, yes, I'm afraid. Exactly like she said here. But I have never seen this question about, have you ever not really detected a gas leak? And that makes sense because it's such a seldom incident. It also almost never happens at all. I mean, very, very seldom houses explode because of gas leaks. But people worry about it. And so what we survey, and I think it's probably not the right way of asking it, what we survey is, are you worried about some potential hazards? Which is kind of the subjective truth because it covers the worries of the individuals. But the way research is often presented, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, is that we then start over-interpreting this by saying people with hyposmia or anosmia, they are more prone to not detecting potentially dangerous situations. And that's actually not true, but they worry more about it.
But I think there is the real worry, which it's interesting, if people have lost the sense of smell, they will start to worry more about being unable to detect off smells in food or gas leaks. There's the opposite thing happens with a lot of elderly people who don't have any worries because their sense of smell might be diminishing so slowly, a bit like the way our eyesight sort of degrades with age and our hearing degrades, but at such a slow rate, we don't notice it day to day. And then a lot of elderly people are often in the position of starting to eat things and their relatives say, no, don't eat that. It's past its sell-by date, it's already off, or you can smell that the milk is sour. And so that's interesting that people who don't know don't mind and don't worry, and then they really might be at risk. All sorts of ghastly bacteriological things can happen. So it's interesting, the gradual loss of smell usually leaves people completely unaware that their sense of smell.
Yes, this is so interesting from various perspectives. Yeah, one of them, we recently did a study or published a study where we asked people, how do you think your sense of smell is? And we just surveyed elderly people. And we did not only ask them about a sense of smell, but also about a sense of vision and about a sense of hearing and tactile perception and smell. And we always ask them, how do you think your sense of smell and the other senses is as related to your peers and as related to your past? And then we tested it and we objectified it. And what we found is that, of course, with increasing age, all senses, they just deteriorate, as you said. And people were very aware of this when it came to vision, and very aware when it came to audition, and kind of aware when it came to tactile perception and somatosensation, and not at all when it came to smell. So, and this was extremely puzzling. So it was not just that they told us, oh yeah, I can smell as good as my peers can, which is okay, because my wife is getting all together with me and she can't smell it, I can smell. But also I can smell as good as I ever could, even when I was very, very young. And this is so fascinating.
Oh, fascinating.
And the second thing, which is interesting in this respect, Thomas Hummer recently did a study where he surveyed people just epidemiologically and also tested the sense of smell. And then he detected a rather huge proportion of people who more or less don't have a sense of smell anymore and are not aware of it. And those people are very interesting, because the ones we do our research about, those are patients suffering from a loss of smell, and they are coming because they want to have help. But there are a lot of people out there who don't suffer, who don't come, who don't want to have help. And if you ask them for depression, for instance, then you don't see anything. They are not depressed, or at least not more depressed than you and me probably are. And so they are totally fine. But it's the ones who are aware, and they are probably aware because, as you said, the smell loss is more sudden, and then you have the experience of a loss. And maybe your neural network did not have the time yet to cope and restructure again.
It's terribly interesting that people are very, very unreliable, all of us, I guess, but people are unreliable about assessing their own sense of smell. I had a wonderful project administrator, and we wanted to test her with Thomas Hummel's sniffing sticks, and we said, let's test you out. And she said, oh, I will be no good, I've got a very bad sense of smell. And we tested her, and she was about the top end the eye scores of everybody we tested. And then other people will tell you, oh, I've got a very good sense of smell. Smells bother me. If I go into a shop, I smell things I don't like, and and yet when tested, they have either an average or even below average sense of smell. So there's this disconnection between the accuracy of our sense of smell and what we think about it. And I worry that carries over even into the cases of people with smell loss or smell disorders. There may be a disconnect between how they're assessing themselves and how they are, either by thinking they're better than they are, or actually fearing it's much worse. And this is why, as you know, and Chrissy has talked about it, I think, in these webinars, trying to get people to do smell training when they're convinced at first, I can't smell anything. And you tell them, please continue, please try, please keep sniffing. And it may be very difficult for them to even know when they are getting something at first, that something comes back. So I think smell is fascinating for this reason, this disconnect between our awareness and our accuracy.
I've noticed something very interesting about what happens sort of in the first year of recovery, for 6 to 9 months, maybe. Something funny happens. A person loses their sense of smell completely, and they get a bit of recovery, maybe, not very organized kind of smell messages that's starting to come back a little bit. And then they get to this point where they do not give they don't rate their own sense of smell. They don't give it, they don't value this, whatever this returning sense of smell is, because it's not complete, because it's not perfect, or the way they remember it. They want to devalue it and say, I don't have a sense of smell.
Yeah.
So we will be, for instance, at Reading, when I'm working with Jane Parker, we'll have someone come in and they'll say, oh no, my sense of smell is very poor, and I don't really smell anything. And then when you give them the sniff and sticks test, they actually perform quite well. So
Yeah.
you have that disconnect. And what I also find is that people who are just beginning to recover, they will still be in the depths of the kind of depression that goes along with total smell loss. And that the recovery from that, those feelings of depression, it takes a long time for that, for the depression to lift, even after the recovery of the sense of smell. So the sense of smell will recover, but the well-being is lagging behind that by a couple of months or maybe even longer. But the two do not work together in sync, but rather they follow one another slowly. Ilona, do you have any thoughts on that?
Now, right now, I would think that also could be something like a disappointment management. So you get subtle impressions of the sense of smell back. You are not sure whether you can trust it. You are not sure whether it will last. And you could be terribly disappointed again if it's not going to work out. And so let's just take it minor until you are sure that something is really coming back. So that would be my immediate guess on that.
Right.
I also wonder, we probably, I think you, Chrissy, have noticed this in the Facebook group. There are a lot of people who had sudden loss of smell because of COVID. They then have slowly and gradually recovered the sense of smell. They say, oh, my sense of smell has come back. And then a little later, they start to notice various things are not right, not as expected. Sometimes some odors are just not as intense. And then, of course, there's parosmia creeping in. And that also makes me wonder, Ilona, whether, was it the case that their whole sense of smell came back fine, or was it that they were so elated recovering something they didn't know they missed until it had gone, that when they get some odors back, they imagine they have them all, and it's only later they notice that some things are wrong or missing or not right.
Yeah, could also be the case, exactly. Yeah. And we sometimes have this, or I remember that when I was located at Thomas Hummel's lab, that there were sometimes incidences of people who came to us with a big suffering from a smell loss, and you could not objectify this. There may have been a slight hyposmia, but not a very big smell loss. Definitely not this big smell loss they presented themselves with. But of course they suffered. Yeah, it's not that they were lying. They suffered, of course. And it may be that they started very high and then they ended in the more or less normal range. And for them, this was a big loss because they were the super athletes before, and then they were just the normal sportsmen. And that could also be something with the recovery. So it is okay, and to everyone else, it may look normal or sufficient, but I know for myself, in my maybe also a little bit blunted memory, that it was much, 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 much better.
So I think, I know that too, from my own sense, that it was better before, and I worry about it as I get older. But I do think there is some way in which our sense of smell is not appreciated by many people until they suffer the loss. And COVID has made so many people aware of smell's contribution to everyday life that they simply hadn't noticed until it suddenly disappeared. And I think that means that when they're getting, when people are getting the sense of smell back or not, you're becoming hyper aware of smell by then. It's not a normal situation because most of the people who have suffered sudden onset of loss of smell paid relatively little attention unless they were interested in perfumes and wines and flowers and so on. They didn't pay much attention. So it's really puzzling for researchers, I think, to figure out what is really going on in the immediate aftermath of loss, in the periods of recovery. And how well do you get your sense of smell back? Well, how good were you at rating it before you lost it? We ask them in questionnaires. We say, how was your sense of smell before your illness? How is it now? Both of those may be very difficult to compare and to judge.
Exactly. And it's so highly biased. So you also know from different studies in depression, when people really have a depression, then they say everything was worse. So yeah, so I am depressed. How was your childhood? Terrible. How is your marriage? Terrible. And so on and so on. Just because my current state superimposes on every kind of memory I have. So memory biases, they are just very powerful. And that's why, exactly as you say, it's not the ideal study at all to ask someone who is a patient now, how was it before you became a patient, which was eventually even 5 years ago. The ideal study would be to survey the people and then they experience a smell loss and then you survey them again. But that's very hard to do because luckily the incidences of smell loss and sudden smell loss are still very few. So you just can't tackle those individuals.
Yeah.
So far, we've been discussing, we've been speaking in general terms. What you've known from your research, Ilona, within your whole career. Obviously, we are now in a new phase with thousands of new people joining our group as a result of COVID-19. One of the things that I notice is the extremely high anxiety levels in the people who are coming into the group. And I'm never really sure about this. I mean, as a psychologist, you might have some insights on this, but I'm never really sure whether the anxiety really at a very high pitch, is it purely to do with the loss of the sense of smell, or are they already so anxious? I mean, we're living in very anxious times. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There's a lot of news about COVID-19 in everywhere you look. So they hear about it. They hear about smell loss. They go straight to Facebook and they're in the group 2 days after they lost their sense of smell, and they are describing a level of suffering that I only rarely saw in the Facebook group before COVID-19. So do you have any idea what might be going on there? Or Barry, I mean, maybe you've got thoughts on this.
I'm keen to know what Ilona's are. We are living in very strange times, as we know. And I think that all of us are suffering from a general background anxiety. We don't always bring it to the forefront of our mind, but it's always there. The news is reminding us. There's the worry about the economy and about our jobs, and there's the worry about whether the pandemic will return and be worse. And I think you can't quite eliminate that from the anxiety that we feel. It's not one of those foregrounded anxieties. It's not something you can sort of, it comes to mind and you worry away at it. It's just like a hum in the background. So I think it's quite difficult to rule out the contribution that's making. And when someone suffers something like sudden loss of smell, is it going to be for life? Is it going to get better? Are they going to remain permanently altered in their sense of smell and eating? I think that's a huge anxiety. So I can see that might make things different.
Barry.
I was going to say that's probably right for some people, but I have a different take, which comes back to something Ilona said, which is very important early on, and that is that difficulty of getting people to understand how it is with you, how experience has changed. Because I think people with anosmia, acquired anosmia, they really struggle to let people know, not just I can't smell, but how much of their experience changes. And having talked to a lot of people and read quite a bit from people, so many aspects of their life change. They say, I feel as though I'm behind glass. I feel as though I'm cut off from my surroundings. I feel as though something has been taken away from the world I'm in. So much has changed. And I tend to, I'm going to wax poetic now, I tend to think that such people are rather like, you know, the ancient mariner. In the rhyme of the ancient mariner, you have this person who goes around, I am today a wedding guest who stoppeth 1 in 3, and tells anyone who will listen the same tale over and over. And it's a puzzling tale, and no one understands it. And it's as if he's bound to keep saying it until someone can help him understand how it is, and actually say something that makes sense of how alien his world, how strange his world has become. And I think people are just very keen to try to get across to the rest of us, so that we will finally be able to say something that kind of makes sense of it, puts it all into position. And we're very far from being able to do that, because we just still don't understand how much smell is connected to the rest of our lives. And in fact, we started, and I'm hoping maybe she will say something about it, Ilona will say something about it. We started with the strange connection between smell and touch. And who would have thought there was a connection there? But there are. I mean, that shows you how much smell is connected with all sorts of things we do, not just eating, not just smelling, lots of our sensory life.
And I'd also like to add that, of course, the value of a Facebook group like the one that we have is that in the absence of being able to describe it adequately to your loved ones or anyone in your circle, you have to depend upon this virtual network to get what you're saying. I mean, that moment with the first time you meet someone who's lost their sense of smell, and you get into this conversation that you just think, yes, that is exactly it. That's exactly it. And that is very therapeutic. And of course, no doctor can supply that unless it's one of the rare doctors who has lost their sense of smell. So that is a really important thing. Right, I think we've got time for just maybe 1 or 2 more quick questions. Aidan, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, I'm just scanning through here, and I see one here that's quite related, because obviously you're speaking about depression and these types of things. Someone here is just asking if antidepressants would actually help your recovering from anosmia, with the link that you were speaking about.
Ilona, what do you think?
I am aware of one study actually finding that antidepressants are helpful in recovering from parosmia. But if I remember correctly, it's a single case study, so probably not terribly informative. It tells you that in principle it could be possible. Otherwise, what we know is from the people with depression, that when the depression is cured, the sense of smell as well gets better, no matter how the depression was cured. So may it be antidepressants, or may it be by cognitive therapy or whatever. So if you cure the depression, the chances are not too bad that the sense of smell also increases. But I think that very much depends on why you lost your sense of smell, of course.
Thank you. Aidan, anything else?
Just one here. We've got a few questions based on nutrition. So just quickly, people are asking how they maintain good nutrition when food choices are really so limited. How would you give some advice?
I think I can say that we will be discussing nutrition and eating in the next webinar. So maybe we'll hold that question for 2 weeks, because I think that's probably best answered in that context.
Okay.
Anything else? I see that we've got 5 questions in the channel. Yeah, okay. Can you discuss quickly, Ilona, the connection between smell and touch?
Yes, please.
Yes, so for touch, we were studying affective touch, which is the touch we have for social communication. We are hugging each other, we are sitting next to each other. And the connection between it is that most people like very much to be touched, and very much they like to cuddle, but not with everyone. And this is where the sense of smell comes into play. As you probably know from Jonas in one of the last webinars, people are able to smell actually if one has a disease. So some hygiene-related behavior and also some inflammatory markers, they present themselves in body odors. And that's why, and we smell whether someone is familiar or not. So we have some defense mechanisms telling us via our olfactory channel, it's safe to touch this, and this person. And then what happens? If our olfactory channel tells us this smell is not pleasant to us for whatever reason, then we don't want to be touched. Very simple.
I guess it's quite interesting because obviously we have social distancing right now, and being able to touch and actually being quite close to smell people is a little bit of a challenge right now. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, the hour has flown by, as it always does. So I think we just have time for me to say thank you very much to Ilona for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful to hear your insights. And thank you also to Barry, as always, for being my guest. And to Aidan, thank you very much for manning the Q&A panel. I hope you join us in 2 weeks. As always, I make sure that people know about these events either on Twitter or through the Facebook group, or if you can always get in touch with me via email if that is what you prefer. But I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for attending, and that will be it for this evening. Good night.
Cheerio.
Thank you very much. Bye.